Thank you, Florin. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me and everyone that worked on this, Veronica, Kirsten, Johanna, all the people behind the scenes who've done so much to make this possible. It's like a really big honor to be doing this, to be one of the few people from the United States and also be the keynote speaker, which is sort of daunting. Hopefully I won't be one of the boring people, but if you feel you need to rush up and bang the gong, just do it. I'm going to try to do something a little unusual. I'm going to begin with a text that I've prepared. I'm going to then speak a little offhand about some images that I brought you, and then kind of go back to the text. I think this text is up online. Florian, do we know where that is? Does someone know? Is it on the website? I think my text is on the website in case you need to follow along. And if I could get my bottle of water and the slides, that would be great. Florian raises a lot of really interesting issues, including questions around hobbyists, questions around art and activism. Are they the same thing? Are they different things? I guess the practice that I've been doing for so many years, practicing over and over again, it mixes a little bit of all this together, but it would be unfair for me to say that I'm a hobbyist because obviously I went to art school and I had all kinds of professional training. But I like to think I bring some of the enthusiasm of hobby sort of mentality to what I'm going to do. Are you talking to me? That's the name of my presentation. This is the first part of it. It starts like this: the apparent reemergence of activist art, political art, interventionist art, socially engaged art, collectivized art. Some see it as a return to concerns dating back to the formation of modernism. Others perceive it as a little more than an artistic genre, a concept useful for organizing the next exhibition, or a means of refreshing up maybe the museum collection. But we know that it's neither simply repetition any more than it is just another aesthetic strategy or category. It is instead a routine, even somewhat predictable upsurge of forces both current and historical, both radical and everyday. And yet this materialization nevertheless threatens the gatekeepers of the artistic canon, who eyeball it with caution, hoping that it will go away and that business will return to usual. And let's see if we can put this up. Okay. For even repetition, as Derrida says, were it to change, neither a thing nor a sign carries with it an unlimited power of perversion and subversion. Which is to say that if nothing else, the making visible of art's social basis is dangerous. Not because it necessarily presents some radical content that is terribly traumatic to the mainstream. And I think this is important to remember. It's often not the content of this work that really disturbs things, but because it actually points to a sort of gap or a lacuna in the narrative, in the traditional narrative, in the art historical narrative itself, a kind of deletion that's not supposed to exist. It's not supposed to be there. So in a sense, this gap or this absence is also a kind of truth made concrete. And it's also an apparition that comes from within as much as it does from below. And I hope that we'll be seeing some of that today and in the days ahead. I do think that this kind of apparition or this materialization is also what structures events like this. It gives us something to work against. There was a time when predominantly elite art world, and I'm thinking kind of in the post-war period, particularly in the United States, it kept a sort of discrete distance between business on one hand and high culture on the other. No matter how disingenuous this was in reality, private sponsorship of culture kept itself away from being overt. For example, we might find a company logo prudently tucked inside an exhibition cataloged, or maybe a brief mention of Mobil Oil Corporation having sponsored this or that television exhibition. We might see a bank lobby, which is already a highly instrumentalized architecture around finance, with a large painting by Frank Stella. But we can take a measure of this distance that was attempted by the work of Hans Haacke and its reception in the early 1970s. And as many of you know, Haacke's projects were revealed a kind of sphere of corporate interests that were actually mostly at odds with the devotees of fine art. What you're seeing here is actually an exhibition installation from the Renaissance Society in Chicago, early 70s. You can see he's using corporate logos, Chase Manhattan Bank, the Mobil Oil Corporation, and when you get close up to them, you discover truths or documentation about these corporations and their relationship to culture that is quite disturbing, at least for a liberal audience. This exhibition was actually not suppressed, but the catalog for it was suppressed, and I don't think it's ever shown up since then. Right? So you have this way of him bringing something out that wasn't supposed to be seen. And you also probably know that in 1971, he was to have an exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum, a solo exhibition, very prestigious. And the entire thing was shut down because of this project, which was really not much more than just sort of a tracing of real estate in New York City. One company or one family that owned many, many, many buildings, and many of them were in disrepair. Haacke simply went to the sort of public records. He put this information into the gallery, and Thomas Messer, who was the director at the time, said, "This is an alien substance that the artist has brought into the gallery." The entire show was eventually canceled. So what's sort of extraordinary is how much has changed since then, right, since the 1970s. What you see here is actually a conga line that was organized by Yvonne Rainier with the Art Workers Coalition, an organization Haacke helped found in the late 60s, down the ramp of the Guggenheim Museum to protest the cancellation of his exhibition. What's happened in the meantime, though, is, in a sense, these logos, the corporate interests, have come out and they've stood in front of the gallery. Art itself has kind of been reborn as upscale brand name in its own right. And I love this juxtaposition here, you know, with the bankers standing in the same space, right? There's a kind of blatant affiliation now with fashion, with wealth, with power, and I'm not talking maybe about the people in this room, but many, many young people, and those of you who teach art know this, flock to programs at places like Yale and UCLA and Columbia University, knowing that they actually stand a modest to fair chance of launching their careers. And some of them do this even before they're out and graduated. People come and select them, picking them, like sports stars out of the studio program. Of course, there are many others, in fact, the majority of others, who will incur enormous debt. And in the United States, this can be as much as $60,000, $70,000, maybe even $80,000 to get an undergraduate degree in art. It forces them to sort of live in debt the rest of their lives, and what do? Well, many of them become arts administrators. There's nothing wrong with any of these professions, but it's not what they studied. Arts administrators, maybe studio assistants, project fabricators, website designers, maybe even art critics. Not that that pays much, but. Several years ago, the art historian Julian Steirischer introduced the term art incorporated to reflect the art world's domination by corporate capital. It's kind of an update of the term culture industry that Horkheimer and Adorno came up with in the 1960s to describe the mass-produced aesthetic banality of that post-war welfare state era. While the culture industry manipulated through acts of passive consumption, art incorporated, Steirischer points out, operates through the churning up of all material bodies, cultures, and associations in the mechanical search for profit-making. So on the one hand, you had a kind of culture industry that was acknowledging in some ways that art and culture were a kind of ideological medium, or Hans Onsenberger's point, it was a kind of consciousness industry. You can manipulate through it. Today, this seems to have collapsed into the raw economy of the art world itself, so that profit-making is in itself a kind of ideological, or maybe it's not even ideological, maybe it's the drive of the art world. Of course, despite the Great Recession, the past couple of decades have been and remain extraordinarily bullish times for the art world. Hedge fund operators now specialize in portfolios of contemporary art, and the investment firm Artist Pension Trust, and you may know how that operates, literally banks that on a limited number of artists making breakout careers, and that will then fund their mutual fund investors. In her 2003 study, Privatizing Culture, the art historian Qintao Wu reported that a spirit of entrepreneurship now dominates every phase of contemporary art, in its production, its dissemination, and its reception. And needless to say, there is also a reward for corporations who support all but the most extreme forms of contemporary art. On the one hand, the aesthetically progressive CEO gains a particular form of cultural capital by his or her vicarious identification with artistic risk-taking. On the other hand, the imaginative free play of art, its creativity, can serve as a pedagogical example for employees who, under enterprise culture, are urged to work creatively, just like artists do, by thinking outside the box. And I'm not the first person who's made these observations. Obviously, people like Gerald Rowning, who's here, Brian Holmes, Ave Shapello, Luke Boltanski, Andrew Ross, Angela McRobbie, many people, let's not forget Richard Florida, have pointed to the connection between art and the emerging so-called creative class. Reciprocally, the new entrepreneurial spirit of art knows no concrete boundaries, as vats of chemicals, animals, copulating couples, and even the site of political protest itself takes its turn as art within the framework of the white cube. And this is an image from the Berlin Biennial of this past few months ago, where the Occupy movement, as you probably know, was invited to be part of the event. This also marks kind of a transition or a difference from the art of the 60s and 70s, because it's not likely we're ever going to see an exhibition sponsored by Dow Chemical or Siemens or IBM that is, let's say, anti-war art or sort of political art. But it's not inconceivable that Apple or Nike or Google or perhaps even Sensor Dynamics might be willing to bankroll such a show. They might even use stealth advertising and guerrilla tactics to sort of promote it. So at such a moment, old-fashioned appeals to the deep transcendental meaning of art, its concrete philosophical truths, if you like, are no more constructive than our calls to the return to principles of revolutionary avant-gardism. For if the former seeks to salvage a long-lost aesthetic autonomy, then the latter is simply incapable of breaking away from the sticky logic of the all-pervasive market. This is why the appearance of a new wave of socially involved art today is all the more curious and maybe even paradoxical. Often working collectively in small, flexibly structured groups, these artists attach their work to buildings, make things to be given away, produce wearable structures for street demonstrations. They infiltrate mainstream media and institutions, sometimes disguised as business people or politicians or even clever entrepreneurs. They create inflatable plastic shelters for homeless people, graffiti spraying robots, and I could go on, and I will show you some examples. Most of these artists express a strong anti-authoritarian tendency, and many, though not all, operate on the very far edge of the mainstream art world. And yet, in a sense, this interventionist art is taking place at a moment when the political far right, and as Florian pointed out, many of these things are happening simultaneously. The political far right is ascendant, the left is weak, labor unions are enfeebled by decades of concessions to neoliberal capital, and when free market hegemony has virtually encircled the globe. At the same time, the tactics employed by interventionist artists, let's say guerrilla interventions, shifting identities, mimicry and camouflage, creative distributions and occupations of the blighted public sphere, the rejection of disciplinary boundaries, hierarchies, and divisions of labor, even the gift-giving of goods and services, all of this could be said to be also out of the playbook of the neoliberal entrepreneurial experiment. They often talk about turning the institution upside down, inverting the usual processes of capital. Now we have armies of amateurs happy to work for free, exclaimed Chris Anderson, who is editor-in-chief of Wired magazine. He's one of the early proponents of the networked creative economy. He goes on to talk about it in ways that contrast the electronic world or the electronic factory from the brick and mortar version. And this is a quote from him. Previous industrial ages were built on the backs of individuals too, but in those days, labor was just that, labor. I have no idea what he means by that. Workers were paid for their time, whether on a factory floor or in a cubicle. Today's pure production machine runs in a mostly non-monetary economy. The currency is reputation, expression, karma, woofie, or simply whim. By now, we're pretty much familiar with this notion of the creative class and its seemingly pivotal role artists play within the paradigm, right? And we've gone over this already. But there's another, maybe less obvious tendency or homology between the surplus army of unemployed or underemployed artists and the people that Chris Anderson is talking about, the creative class. Besides the fact that maybe they share, to some extent, the anarcho-capitalist dream of a kind of perpetual peer-to-peer motion machine, all wired together by the internet. I would ask this question, and maybe this is one we can talk about later in more detail. What if it's not the alleged radicalism of artists that make them such an attractive model to the priests and priestesses of the new networked economy of neoliberal capital? What if instead it's actually the way art as a sphere of aggregate activity demonstrates a unique capacity to mobilize its own inherent overproduction and redundancy? In other words, what if it's not the transgressive risk-taking and scrappy nonconformity and all that out-of-the-box rhetoric that artists are supposedly so good about, but instead the way contemporary artists, including those who are visible as much as those who are not so invisible, maybe the ones who take out the trash and do the dishes, what if it's the way they manage to leverage their own precariousness and risk while collectively producing astounding levels of stuff, installations, ideas, events, and entire fantasy institutions? Perhaps it's no wonder that the CEOs and sociologists and even municipal planners look to artists as a kind of class or category and see a kind of alchemical workforce, a kind of miraculous workforce for inventing new brands and gentrifying cities and maybe even saving capitalism. Of course, there's a more mundane explanation for this, and that is, as my friend Alan Moore once said, I spent a lot of money throughout my life just to be an artist. He's now an art historian, and he's still spending money. But there still have to be ways to sort of delimit or prune all of this activity. And that's one of the questions maybe that we need to sort of address. In other words, how do you filter social production, especially when it's so excessive, without erasing its fecundity? Or to put it another way, how do you keep the magic P2P goose laying the golden eggs once you've clipped its feathers or put it behind bars? Think of WikiLeaks or the hacker group Anonymous, both of which have forced the neoliberal experiment to confront its own limitations. But once again, is it some specific truth that is concrete, or is it, as Julian Assange put it, that some information is faintly glowing because of the amount of work that's been put into suppressing it? What sort of ontological status does concealment have? And what about untruth? Untruth. Is it also concrete? After all, lies have measurable material effects in the world. Think of the way rumors that liberal philanthropist George Soros secretly underwrites the Occupy movement. It's true, people have been saying this. Or claims that a wealthy Russian oligarch paid Pussy Riot to perform in Moscow's Church of the Christ the Savior. Or most of all, the disinformation that's used in war. It's a dilemma not only for the neoliberal imaginary, but for all of us. No one would argue that social networks have shown themselves to be exemplary in amplifying communication or making information more transparent at times. But there's also networks are good at spreading disinformation. And it's a phenomenon that Eve Sedgwick Kosofsky, a late theorist in the United States, described as ignorance effects. Ignorance effects that are capable of being harnessed, licensed, and regulated on a mass scale for striking enforcements. seems that the possibility of a networked resentment or raisonnement was never imagined to be part of the neoliberal political model, any more than for practitioners of tactical media, or for the Occupy movement, or for many of us, perhaps. And yet, resentment, as much as untruth holds forth, has concrete effects. And unfortunately, I would say that many of those emanate from my own country, United States. Recall the performance of U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell before the United Nations, February 5th, 2003. He did, among other things, he presented diagrams, photographs, alleged facts, and statistics. But most disturbingly of all, he pulled out that tiny vial of replicated anthrax and held it between his fingers to make the case for the invasion of Iraq. Untruth was made concrete. It was not WikiLeaks, which didn't exist at the time, but the UN's own weapons inspector, Hans Blix, who replied, you know, Iraq, it has no massive biological weapon program. It has no mobile labs. It doesn't have 18 trucks filled with anthrax and other toxic organisms. Nevertheless, the bombing of Baghdad began about a month later, and Defense Secretary Rumsfeld chanted, "We know where the weapons of mass destruction are." Needless to say, they were never found. And Powell later described his performance before the UN and before the world as a painful blot on his record. And I suppose a blot is also a concrete thing. Right? It's a material sort of remnant of a bruising encounter, maybe with the truth in this case. But what concerns me most today is the political and corporate elites of the world have really sort of already decided our fate. Lazily lacking the political will to deal with the current global crisis, either by questioning their own fortunes or assumptions, they will default to a familiar cure that goes by the name der Krieg, or la guerre, or Vojna, or war. It's a cure not intended for us, however, not a cure for our problems, but for the 99%, or for what Mitt Romney said, called the 47%. It's instead a sacrifice to the god known as the economy. To cite Bertolt Brecht, a poem, actually a sort of poem and image combination he did in 1937, illustrated series of poems called War Primer. Alas, poor Yorick of the burnout tank, upon an axle shaft your head is set. Your death by fire was for the Domite Bank, to whom your parents are still in debt. The image, as grotesque as it is actually an actual image of a Japanese soldier killed in the Second World War. The failure of the post-communist neoliberal experiment should not become an excuse for more disaster and destruction. And if we do nothing else this week, we should pledge to stand together against the growing global drumbeat of this age-old economic curative. Because regardless of what, if you think of yourself as an artist or as an activist or both at the same time, just as Brecht pointed out, we will all still be in debt after the smoke clears, unless we address the malady that underlies the crisis in a very concrete way. Now I want to, how much time do we have here? I want to just do a little bit more of a personal reflection for a second on how, maybe why I'm standing here, why Florian invited me. And if anybody's seen some of my talks before, I apologize, I show this image all the time. But when I moved to New York City from Philadelphia in 1977, this is the neighborhood I moved to. This is not Beirut in 2006. This is the East Village, we actually called it the Lower East Side of Manhattan, somewhere around probably 7th or 8th or 9th Street, circa 1977. And the city, as the country had gone through several serious recessions, but the city had particularly collapsed, as many northeastern cities in the United States had collapsed its infrastructure at the time by the late 70s. And there was the 1975 famous Daily News cover when Gerald Ford, who took over from Richard Nixon when he was forced to resign, famously saying, I'm not going to bail out New York City. He didn't quite use these words, but it's more or less the same thing. New York City had gone into complete default. The status of its bonds were considered junk bond status. It was actually bankrupt. And unlike previous occasions, the federal government said, you know, there's not going to be a bailout. We're not going to do anything. You're on your own. Well, we know what this is now very clearly, right? This is the strategy of the IMF. This is the strategy of the World Bank. It's the strategy of structural adjustment. And of course, they did bail out the city, but they only did it after the city agreed to cut back on its labor expenses, to force unions to take givebacks, cut back on libraries, cut back on health services, cut back on transportation, and so on and so forth. In other words, shrink social spending, and then the money flowed again. Artists responded in various ways to these conditions. Famously, the real estate show took place in the last hours of 1979. A group of artists broke into a building in downtown Manhattan, set up an exhibition called the Real Estate Show, critiquing landlords, etc. Within hours, the police came and threw all their work out in the street, locked the building back up again. It was just by chance that Joseph Beuys was in town, and they did a press event, and the mayor felt so shamed he gave them back the space. A different space, actually, nearby. Ultimately, that became the basis for ABC No Rio, which is an ongoing project today. There are projects like this, which were silkscreen on the side of buildings, on abandoned cars. I mean, this really is what the South Bronx and much of Manhattan looked like. Out of this, other groups emerged, particularly in the early 80s. Some of you may be familiar with group Material. There was about 14 people in the group initially. They had a space on 13th Street. They showed exhibitions. They did curated exhibitions about consumerism, et cetera. And then the group kind of had a falling out and broke down into more or less 4 people, at which time they started questioning their own motives. This was a manifesto, which I won't read to you, but more or less it says, what were we thinking? You know, we had this space, and we were doing exactly the thing we were trying to critique. And for a period of time, they did work in the streets and in subways around New York. And this is like 1981 or 82. There was the group that I became part of called Political Art Documentation Distribution, which I'll just call PAD. It was really formed by Lucy Lepard, the writer in many respects, who had been collecting materials about social and political art, presumably the reason we're here, in her loft in Soho, and couldn't handle it anymore. And so she said, can we start a group that files this and makes an archive? And more or less that's what PAD was, except almost nobody wanted to do the work of archiving. So we started a newsletter. By the way, all of this is on a website I have that you can download for free, which I will show you. We did art for demonstrations. We claimed that our goal was to provide artists with a link to political organizations. So the idea was not so much to politicize art, but to take political art that was already being made and find ways of connecting it with people who were doing community activism, anti-war activism, anti-nuclear activism. We also did work around gentrification, which was rampant by the mid-'80s in the same part of the neighborhood that I was showing you before. Suddenly, a neighborhood where fires would break out because the landlords would burn their buildings down and collect the insurance on them, all of this stopped around 1983, 84, and the property values went up and everything started to become gentrified. We tried to reach out to artists to get them to think about their relationship to gentrification, even suggesting a kind of trickle-down economic theory for the art world. And all of this work was often done in the street. We even named this particular street corner Guggenheim Downtown, which is where we had our opening. It's now a very expensive restaurant, corner of 10th Street and Avenue A. An inflatable Pac-Man Uncle Sam, which was carried in demonstrations. All of the work that we did finally end up as an archive, and it's at the Museum of Modern Art, and it is actually accessible. If you're interested, you have to make an appointment, and you can go and you can look through the material. More or less, it looks something like this. It's in a warehouse in Queens. And of course, it's ironic that a group that really sort of talked about being completely opposed to sort of the function of the art world ended up in one of the main pillars of the art world. But that seems to be often the case. Some examples of what's inside the archive. What I think is important to bear in mind, at least this has been important to me, is that a lot of this work was done with the idea that we as activist artists or as artists who had become politicized were opposed to the institutions that surrounded us. We were against them. They were, in a sense, the enemy, or they were there to have demands made of them. And I think what's changed quite a bit is the way that artists today seek out and infiltrate many of these institutions, seeing it less as a question of opposition than one of tactics, as Florian so eloquently put it in terms of Desserteau's idea. Carnival knowledge, which combined the vernacular of circus or the sideshow with feminist sexual politics. This is actually a tap dance to show young women how to use the diaphragm and other sexual devices, prophylactants. I couldn't help think about Pussy Riot when I saw this. This is 1981, 82. Later on, I got involved in another collective, which maybe this is a way to explain it. On the corner of 13th Street, there's this plaque on the wall, okay? Stuart Davis, just out of curiosity, anybody know who Stuart Davis is? Nobody's a student of art history, I guess. Okay, anyway, he was an important American painter. He actually isn't very well known today, but this plaque was put up on the building where he actually had his studio, probably by the people that owned it, and it goes on to talk about how he was influenced by jazz and et cetera, et cetera. What it doesn't say is that he was one of the chief theoreticians for art and culture within the American Communist Party. It's just not mentioned. Right? So our idea, now we're talking late 80s, was what if we could go into the city streets and begin to sort of recover those lost histories, this kind of concrete truth in a way, and put it back up. And so we started a group called Repo History. It was actually named after the movie Repo Man, if you've seen that. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. We would go around repossessing these histories, and we got permission, although at first it was going to be a guerrilla project, we got permission to put up signs around the city with these alternative histories on it. The first slave market, which was on Wall Street, not far from where the stock exchange was founded. We put these signs up for about a period of a year, and then we had to take them down. That was the permit. And I'll just give you an example. The back of the signs had text on them. And we had a map that you could use to walk around and locate all of the signs and discover these alternative histories. This particular sign, which was by Jim Costanzo, was, not surprisingly, in front of the stock exchange. What was interesting was those blue banners you see indicate that it was the 200th anniversary of the founding of the stock exchange. Now, this is 1992. And the stock exchange people called up the department that gave us permission and said, you have to remove this sign, you know. It was talking about the advantages of an unregulated free market economy. It was made by Jim Costanzo. And the person at the Department of Transportation who gave us the permit said, no, we gave out a permit, we don't do that. And what I realize in retrospect is that this was the last bit of a kind of different New York City and a different kind of mentality around social programs, around bureaucracies. There were still elements within the municipality of New York who understood the importance of the public sphere and the commons and thought in those terms, thought about access to those things. The man who said this, the man who defended us, was then pushed out by Rudolph Giuliani, the right-wing Republican mayor that we had a few years later. And we did other projects about gay and lesbian history, and we did projects that finally got us into trouble with Mayor Giuliani, which we had to sort of defend. And we got press, which was important because actually the art world didn't pay much attention to what we did. And we inspired some other artists, including Poco Society. And they literally go around and they install contradictory plaques in places around Lower California, in Southern California, San Diego, Los Angeles, talking about the Chicano history, let's say, of a particular region. Now, I was talking about how those kind of more oppositional politics seem to have morphed into a kind of interventionist and tactical politics. This is, of course, a kind of knitting, guerrilla knitting done in Texas. Work by Camp Baltimore around issues of housing, do-it-yourself culture, temporary services. An interesting group out of Chicago which almost has literally reinvented the concept of the institution. They have a printing press, they give out small grants for doing public work, they create their own public art, they do pedagogy, they do online services, and they do all of this really without being a traditional 501c3, which is like an NGO here, which gets money from the government, which there isn't much, or corporate elites. And I'm just going to kind of breeze through this because I want to get to my last little bit, and maybe there'll be a couple minutes we can have a conversation. The work of Critical Art Ensemble. You may have remembered that the man on the right, who was one of the founders, Steve Kurtz, was being prosecuted by the Department of Justice in the United States, initially for bioterrorism, and then ultimately for mail fraud. Of course, the work of the Yes Men. And perhaps this brings this point most clearly is that if in the past we stood outside the Museum of Modern Art and said, you know, you must do something for us. You have to sort of understand that we're the artists, we supply you with culture, you need to sort of be more responsive to us. This would be Art Workers Coalition, let's say, in the 60s. The Yes Men they look like the people that are on the inside. They move inside the building. They do a tactical operation, and then they sort of disappear. Michael Rakowitz, Inflatable Homeless Shelter, Robot Graffiti, Reverend Billy. Bill, are you here? He's with us this week, and so on and so forth. The Tactical Ice Cream Truck by the Center for Tactical Magic. It rolls out, provides free ice cream, Wi-Fi, and brochures about all kinds of things from ecological toilets to the Black Panther movement. Agencias, Ready to Revolt clothing, Yomango, some of you may know this work. Accessories that allow you to do shoplifting and other kinds of illegal actions. All of this is quite different. Michael Rakowitz, who did an interesting piece not too long ago in Budapest, where he talked about the neoliberalization of the city and the real estate that was disappearing and asked people to imagine alternatives to it. And of course, a lot of this was tied to the counter-globalization movement. This is a photograph of the battle in Seattle by Alan Sekula. And this is a little bit more up to date, where a group of us got together with the Aaron Burr Society, and that's actually Jim Costanzo, who did the falling man sign in '92 outside of Wall Street. This is us actually trying to levitate the Federal Reserve Bank in Lower Manhattan. That's the bank there. The Federal Reserve is where there's enormous, stockpiles of gold bricks underground. And I still don't quite understand the whole thing, but they move these around to kind of work out balance of trade with different countries, right? So it's all there. We thought maybe we could rise the whole building up, much as Abby Hoffman once tried to do with the Pentagon. And curiously enough, the woman with the long hair was one of Abby Hoffman's wives, and she had heard about this and came by and helped us try to lift the building. We didn't do it. But more recently, just a week ago, September 17th, the anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, people still being incredibly imaginative about how they're going to describe in public space what's going on. This kind of blob that rolls over a sort of a businessman or a student or whatever, student debt. Bain Capital, making a reference to the most recent Dark Knight movie. And demonstrators moving through the streets in what they described was a kind of swirling effect at times. In other words, they realized that the New York Police Department would be very quick to arrest them, and they were. But what they would do is they would break out into small groups, move around in intersections and block traffic, and then just as the police were getting ready to arrest them, they would disperse again. And they talked about these kind of swirls as coming out of various affinity groups within the Occupy movement. So the tactics of Occupy modifying themselves for changing conditions a year later. Free Pussy Riot. One of the key focuses that has come out of the most recent phase of Occupy is the problem of debt. And I mentioned this before, particularly student debt. And one of the tactics that someone described to me was quite interesting. I didn't realize this, you can actually buy debt, much like carbon trading. If you have money, you can buy someone else's debt. The idea here that some people have is to sort of get enough money together, buy a large portion of debt, and then just forgive it, just erase it. Right? Of course, it's going to be a symbolic gesture because they could never raise enough to really cover all the debts involved, but it's an interesting kind of tactic. But I couldn't help but notice also similarities. The work that was done then and the work done in the past. Recent project by Occupy Museums, who I believe were also invited to this event, and the work of Art Workers Coalition demonstrating in front of the Museum of Modern Art in '73. Occupy Everything, or the occupation of a nuclear power plant in the United States that I was part of in 1979, attempted occupation. Carnival Knowledge, and of course, Pussy Riot. Just going to conclude now, and maybe we'll have a minute to talk and see if I can get I wanted to show you a project, a sort of art project that I did which relates to all of this, and let that sort of play in the background. I've recently written this book, which comes out of a series of shorter essays that I wrote over the years called Dark Matter, and I wanted to talk about just briefly, and I'm not going to read my whole script here, I'm going to just go over it. Dark matter really, I stole the idea or borrowed the idea from the idea of astrophysics, where they talk about the fact that the majority of the universe is in fact invisible, right? It's made of some substance, they don't know what it is. Whatever it is, though, it's essential to the way the universe operates. Okay, so what you're looking at is a project I call I Drone, and it's kind of a predator drone with a skin of my own personal archive to some extent, or things that I was involved with over the years. And I can see it's frozen here at the moment, but when you go to it and you click on various documents that are on it, like this, it opens up into various web pages, and this one to repo history, and each one has a different either a different website or PDF document that you can actually download off of it. It's a kind of flying archive. It's a kind of past that kind of chases me around, and it's also something that doesn't look very much like a predator drone. It looks more like a kind of pathetic airship in some ways, and it was meant to be that way. Just to go back and finish up, this idea of dark matter being the material that we don't see that actually supports the universe, okay? So if we live in 6% of the universe, 96%, 94% of it, this is why I became an artist, 94% of it is something that the scientists don't know what it is. Now, I sort of thought to myself, well, what if the art world, what if culture is actually much the same? What if most of what is being produced is not only invisible to the mainstream, but is essential for the mainstream? And this is more or less, in a sense, the premise that I began operating with. It's not so much to ask the question, what is dark matter? I mean, yes, that's an interesting question. And of course, scientists very much want to know what dark matter is. The art world, by and large, isn't interested. But the real question is why, if I'm correct, why do the majority of artists and people who do creative work, why are they invisible? And what does the visible part of the art world, the institutional part of it, what does it gain from all of that energy, all of that social production? This is the kind of approach that I take with the book. And I'm just going to finish up by reading you this last bit of that, because it relates to this idea of a kind of history from below. To realize such a history from below, and in order to construct a non-space for, or sort of a non-productivity, and maybe this comes back to Florian's question about the relationship between art and activism, to do this out of this idea of this kind of missing dark matter, or what's not seen, this kind of social productivity, means generating filters contrary to those of the market, while simultaneously recognizing that any move towards self-valorization or institutionalization is a risk. It has a risk of failure, it has other risks, and we can talk about Paris in 1871, we could talk about May in 1968. Militant street theater, counterfeit corporations, interventionist research portals, knitting networks, pie throwers, ninjas, snake charmers, strange lights that go up and down, river rafts, amateur scientists. The emerging aesthetics of resistance may be no more than a minor art of attractions and marvels and tactics. And it may indeed reflect, in some ways, the very enterprise culture of neoliberal capitalism that we, in a sense, are so opposed to, maybe more than we would like to admit. But a politics of sometimes overt and sometimes tepid acts of delinquency, a politics of occasionally bitter gestures of discontent, as well as gifts of resistance, absolutely must always impart a future expectation. And now and again, this other social non-productivity appears to mobilize its own redundancy, acknowledges its own surplus identity of too much talent, too much labor, too much redundancy, too much subjectivity, even too much sheer concrete truthful materiality. And in doing so, it momentarily frees itself from even attempting to be usefully productive for capitalism, or for art incorporated, for that matter. In other words, maybe part of the answer is that we embrace our own surplus redundancy. All the while, it may then identify itself with this larger ocean of a kind of dark matter creativity, a kind of ungainly excess of seemingly useless actors and activity that the market views as waste, or perhaps, at best, as a raw, interchangeable resource for biometric information and crowdsourcing. The archive, this dark matter surplus archive, has in fact split open, and we are its dead capital, and it is, in a sense, the dawn of the dead. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions. Do we have about two minutes for questions?
A lot of minutes.
Good.
We have now we gained a lot of time, so we're so afraid of losing time, and I was so nervous that I was speaking so fast. Now we have 25 minutes for break, but also to maybe continue a bit the conversation that you started. And maybe I would we have also a microphone, but you can just also raise your voice. But maybe I would start with something, because you of course touched upon a lot of things that will be relevant during this week, and you mentioned a lot of people that are here. But one thing that is in the center of you, and you of course talked about it, but I'm still, maybe you can elaborate a bit more, the question of how can tactics, interventions, all these things, can they still be powerful in some way? I mean, we have you showed the image from Occupy and others, but isn't it just also in the end just a nice picture for the New York Times cover that fulfills also again, okay, there are some people working for us on it. And how did this change in your perception of over the last 30, 40 years that you were talking about?
Yeah. I mean, this goes back to your question about a hobby, or the question that was raised, or the comment that was raised, that art is a kind of left-wing hobby. I don't know. It's a difficult question to answer in any positive way. I mean, it would be foolish to say that we have no effect whatsoever. It would be wrong to say we have no effect whatsoever as artists, as cultural workers, on the sphere of politics and on the sphere of economics. And sometimes that can really take place by leveraging the power of the art world, and sometimes it takes place by completely bypassing that and doing something else. On the other hand, I think if we overestimate what we can do, if we expect artists to really be the vanguard of some new political sort of movement, I think that's a huge mistake. I don't think that's ever been the case. I think artists have generally followed political movements and radical change rather than really instigated them. And I don't think it's any different at this point. So it's maybe a question of sort of applying a little bit more modesty to our circumstances, and at the same time, from there, perhaps gaining a better foothold in what we're doing. That would be mine.
Maybe we can have some light a bit in the audience, a bit more. So,
someone has a question.
There's some microphones coming around.
Hello, amen.
Hallelujah, Bill.
Praise be. I was also, like Florian, I was intrigued by the dichotomy of interventionism and what's the other one?
Hobbies?
Hobbies. And I was thinking that interventionism was when you worked inside the institution and tricked them, like Andy with the BBC, and that then maybe I was just making a fantasy of my own hopes. I was going to the next idea as artists really being among the leaders in change.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
there's hobby and there's intervention. Then I was going to a third thing to make my.
Yeah. You're getting Hegelian on us, you know. Yeah.
Am I getting Hegelian on you? I hope I don't ruin your clothing.
It's too late.
I hope all of your clothing is from thrift stores, Dr. Sholette.
It is. No, I mean, I think you raise a really interesting point, and your own practice, to use a very fashionable word in the art world, I think is an example of taking the idea of intervening, as you put it, within what seems to be legitimate power structures or institutions through, let's say, a kind of camouflage or mimicry, and in a way actually then establishing a sort of institutional presence of your own. And I know a lot of people have a real problem with the term institution, and they don't like to think of themselves establishing things. Nevertheless, in a way, I do think that's exactly what's happened. You begin by critiquing the world of politics, you begin by critiquing the world of the art world, and you come up with a name like the Church of Stop Shopping. And in the process, you sort of find yourself creating an entire choir and an entire movement and an entire mini institution of its own that in some ways operates maybe better than the one that you began critiquing. And maybe that comes back to your question a little bit, is that this process of breaking down society that we've watched with neoliberalization, and I showed you lots of images of what happened in New York City, and you go from one kind of disaster, which is the collapse of the city, to another kind of disaster, which is this kind of bourgeois, ultra-gentrified city. But the society seems to have just kind of disappeared somewhere in the middle of it. And this is one area where artists have done something very interesting, and that is almost kind of recreate the social matrix at a very micro level. I'm almost creating these kind of mock institutions. And I would say, Bill, that what you've done is exactly that, along with damaging my suit, of course. But,
we have people at our festival here who are here among us, who were the very first people who talked about the Occupy Wall Street movement in Tompkins Square Park in the East Village, near these pictures of devastation from your youth. I they are all completely conversant in art theory. I went up to one of them today and said, well, truth is concrete. Is that a reaction against, are we reacting against the famous 60s and 70s French philosophers and situationism? And are we rediscovering that we can do something that is moral in an absolute way, and it's a great coming back? And this gentleman said, no, they're not mutually exclusive. The great decentering, the great there is no such thing as an absolute truth argument of the French philosophers and post-structuralism and so forth, they were absolutely right. You just have to have something else. Mm-hmm. And, so I was thinking interventionism and the art can be very central to a movement. Just coming up in my mind just right now, Sam Cooke wrote that song, A Change Is Gonna Come. So you have a pop hit in the United States called A Change Is Gonna Come. And everybody's walking around singing this song, A Change Is Gonna Come. Yeah. And he gives all of that money to Dr. Martin Luther King.
Sure.
So everybody's singing it, and he's helping finance the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with the proceeds.
The Freedom Riders,
the Freedom Riders, Mayakovsky level. That's right in there.
Yeah, Mayakovsky. The Freedom Rider singers in the 50s and 60s.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's lots and lots of examples of this connective tissue. But the question you put on the table is an interesting one. How do people sort of not that they're all not interesting questions, but the one is how do you sort of uphold on the one hand this kind of anti-epistemological or whatever philosophical ideas that we've taken so much to heart coming out of the 1950s and 60s, and at the same time reach for something that's concrete enough to put a foundation under it. I don't know, maybe there's people in the audience that might actually have an interesting comment on that.
Yeah, does it work? Okay. My name is Hans Abbing. I have a question. You mentioned that, lots of this work, one way or another, ends up in the pillars of the established art world. Yeah, in the museums, etc. Are sometimes bought, exhibited. It's hard to. Can't we have it a bit louder? Okay. So I was mentioning that lots of the work you were showing, one way or another, ends up in the pillars of the established art world, in the museums, etc. I wonder, as artists, maybe not Sam Cooke, but the artists, who have been educated in the art world, do you have it in the back of your mind while you are making this critical art that it may end up in these pillars? I know some artists who certainly have it in the back of their mind, some young artists, and maybe they're not the best in this area. But from your experience, and does it matter? Does it make a difference? Does it make it better or worse? Does it make the art more or less effective as critical art when you're so aware of where it may end up?
So if you're aware of the fact that your work may end up in the Museum of Modern Art or someplace prestigious, does it diminish maybe or enhance the quality of the work as a political critique, right? Not as art, right? And God knows, that's an impossible answer. I have no answer for that. What I like to think about is going back to the hobby question in a way that was raised before, is that hobbyists just take a credible pleasure in the work that they do. They don't think about, this is going to end up, in a museum, this is going to end up being respected. That kind of joy has been drained out of the art world, And I say that as someone who teaches young artists, and I'm ashamed to say that it's very hard to bring that back in many cases, because what they see is precisely what you're pointing to, is this ultimate possibility of institutionalization or respect or whatever. And I try very hard to sort of point them away from it, but it's almost impossible, I think, to not, have one ear cocked to the powers that be. you're socialized vis-a-vis the institutions that train artists, that's for sure. So if there is a value, I think, to what's happening with Occupy and with this kind of explosion of what I call dark matter, which is coming into visibility, whether we like it or not, and whether we like it or not, because some of it's very awful. And I don't mean aesthetically, I mean politically awful. What I think is happening, though, is this possibility of thinking in terms of the hobbyist, the amateur in a new way, and maybe that will be a very positive thing, perhaps. You know, there's someone right here. Oh, okay.
Greg,
We'll come back to you. Yeah.
I'm over here, actually. Over here.
Where are you? Oh, okay.
Over here.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Well, it's interesting you mentioned the joy and that some of that's gone for your students, because I think that that relates very much to the debt that you've been mentioning, and you brought up student debt not just as, you know, a political activity that is, you know, having students out in the street, and it's a big part of Occupy, but I think that there's actually a new phenomenon that's happening with debt. And I had a really amazing conversation with a teacher at NYU who said, you know, 20 years ago when he was in school, he maybe amassed like $4,000, $5,000 of debt, and he could pay it off, you know, in a year. And now students have 100,000. I mean, I met a few students during a project I was doing in New York that had $160,000 of debt, and it's just undergrads, and they were studying literature, you know. And so something that this teacher, actually Stephen Duncombe, who you may know, mentioned to me is that is actually an economic pressure that's put on the students so that they can't actually just be artists or be creative thinkers. They have to think about money. How do I make money? And that's where I think the joy goes out, because they're under an immense amount of pressure to pay not just their rent, but actually pay hundreds of dollars a month in loan debt and know that it's going to last for 30, 40 years of their life. So there's this economic pressure to make money doing what they do. And every artist that goes even to a mid-level, you know, college to study is going to have that kind of debt, and thus the economic pressure stifles their creativity.
Well, it's absolutely both, because it's, on the one hand, we could say debt disciplines us, and it's not just artists, but people who go through this process of the education factory. The debt that we come out with disciplines us on a day-to-day basis for the rest of our lives. As I think it was Sylvia Federici who said, you know, it's like Federici, that basically it's training you for the real world, so you become indebted while you're in school, because that's what it's going to be like when you get out, right? I think it was Deleuze said something like, you know, man is no longer man alone, but man in debt, in a way, right? Individual. But it's both this economic pressure and, at the same time, as this gentleman pointed out, I think the draw of the sort of possibility of success, which would maybe illusory, I think in most cases, erase the debt, you know. And so you're constantly like a mouse chasing after various kinds of cheese. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello? Okay. Hey, Greg and everyone. I just wanted to ask you if you have a moment, Greg, to kind of, more recently, I was reading through your book, and you were unpacking the different, the category of dark matter in creative culture. You were sort of unpacking some of the various reasons why that might be, and maybe even categorically different types. And I'm only kind of underscoring. I actually didn't catch the person's name who, in the red and black striped shirt, who was asking you this question. But anyhow, about. I think what came to me is I kind of wanted to hear a little bit about people who decide purposefully to be invisible. Not just that their hopes are dashed, or that they happen to be under someone else's thumb and they're by de facto not as visible, but that people choose to do this for very specific reasons, who have all the opportunities in the world to be visible. And they also help to make up what you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, this is Scott Rigby from Base Camp in Philadelphia. And Scott, I mean, your work and has been so important to the way I think. And in some ways, this whole concept of redundancy, which you worked on and which we worked on together at a point, was really crucial in thinking about this problem. Because I think I realized one of the things as I was in political art documentation many years ago was that, I looked around, we produced this archive. The archive is big, and if you go through it, in fact, you'll find a few of the names you know. There'll be Hans Hacke, there'll be Martha Rosler, there'll be other people, and then you'll find dozens and dozens of people who you'll never have heard of. In fact, I've been doing a project recently where I went back to the year I was born. I won't tell you what year it was, 1956. And I went through art magazines that were around at the time in the United States, and I started going through all the names that were listed of people who had reviews. And then I read them to someone who is older than me, who would remember or not remember, and about 2% of the 60-some names out of one art magazine from 1 month, this person could identify. So there's this enormous kind of archive of people who are simply forgotten, and yet the productivity that they pushed into this thing called the art world is tremendous. It wouldn't operate without them. It wouldn't operate without all of that sort of dark matter. Right? But it is enormously redundant. I mean, art is an overproduction machine of incredible proportions, which is why I was trying to talk before about this idea, well, maybe that's what makes it so interesting as a model to certain kind of entrepreneurial minds, right? How do you harness overproduction and, in a sense, do it as an aggregate so that some people benefit, some people don't? Why do some people identify, though? And coming back to the point that I started with, when I thought about Pat after a while, I realized, in a way, I was almost sort of recognizing myself and my colleagues as being part of this kind of redundant machinery, as being part of this kind of invisible sort of army. And it gave us kind of freedom, which I think was really particular. Maybe coming back to the gentleman in the striped shirts point, that by sort of identifying yourself as someone who's not going to be necessarily part of that sort of unique small cluster of successful people, but really sort of understanding your role inside this kind of dark matter machine, you're then free to do certain things that you wouldn't feel you could do if you wanted to have a proper career. And if you look at the kind of way collectives operate, they often just generate all kinds of crazy stuff. And people enter them in order to do things that they wouldn't do individually. It gives them a kind of license. So again, it's a kind of economic model within, I guess, something along the lines of the plausible art worlds you're going to be presenting here, I assume, right? You and Stephen? Right? What day is the presentation? Maybe we should put a plug in now. Tuesday night, okay. That's why I stayed long.
Greg? So I could interrupt you?
We could talk afterwards. Yeah.
The conversation, which I want to interrupt it, but maybe postpone it. I think we can have one more fast question with a fast answer.
Keep it quick.
And then I would invite you, Greg is here, and to continue the conversation either in the bar or in the room that we have for that. So one question, where is it?
Can you hear me?
I can. I'm listening. I'm just going to show you this. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you made a distinction between the kinds of visual practices that Occupy uses and like group materials work. So activisms by artists or the visual practices of activists. If you might just say no, you don't make a distinction between those two. But I think that there is a difference between those kinds. I mean, I think that there is a difference between.
Tell me what you think the difference is.
Right. So I'm asking you this because I'm not really sure. But I think that there is a difference, but I'm not exactly sure why. I think it is, and is it just infrastructural? Is it just
a difference between kind of like group material does as political art and what people let Occupy do maybe as political
metaphorical
culture.
protests or something.
Yeah.
Or sort of. Sort of like interventions in public space.
Right.
Like, what's the difference?
Well, there's one obvious difference is that we talk about one as somehow connected to the art world. We frame it that way.
Yeah.
Group material is clearly framed that way significantly, and we don't tend to talk about Occupy as necessarily part of the art world. Although I would make the argument that it very much is. And maybe it is a kind of wonderful left-wing hobby, actually, in some way, in all the positive ways we could think about that terminology, kind of embrace that idea instead of sort of rejecting the idea or making light of it. But I think, there are obviously subtler levels to this, but I think that's an important one that we always forget, is that, once you're framed within sort of the art historical canon,
Yeah.
that's very significant in its way for those of us who study that particular thing. For people on the outside, it's probably meaningless. And some of the work that group material did, no one would have known it was art.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have. Not walking down 14th Street when they did the Dazebau posters, which I showed, which were just done in the middle of the night. They were put up illegally, or the stuff in the subways. So it was, it's complicated, but yeah. That's my website, darkmatterarchives.net.